Hello, class. Just back here to talk a little bit about the later chapters of Matthew's Gospel. I'd like to look here at the famous Woe chapter, which is chapter 23 of Matthew. You're going to get a few little videos here. Father Wargle and my fingers are a little tired, so we thought it would be better to talk to you about what's in these chapters and maybe what we think is important. So let's take a look. Let's just dive right in. Matthew 23, Jesus goes on a tirade, that's the only way you can call it, against his enemies among the scribes and the Pharisees. But what's interesting is how he starts this. In Matthew 23, chapter 23, verse 2, I believe, or verse 3, one of those, he says, the scribes and Pharisees sit on the seat of Moses, therefore you should obey them, but do as they say, not as they do, because, basically they're hypocrites. Now that's kind of odd, isn't it? Because only a few chapters back in Matthew 16, Jesus tells us what? Beware of the leaven of the scribes and the Pharisees. In other words, don't listen to these guys. You're not the guys you want to listen to. So should we obey them? Should we not? This is one of the many paradoxes in Matthew's gospel. The whole gospel is rift with little tensions like this, and they're really for you, the reader, to sort out. So you all figure it out. So figure out how it works. Do we obey them? Do we not? What is Jesus actually saying to do here? Okay, what is Matthew wanting us to take away from this? That's one point. Okay, the second point is, one thing in Matthew's gospel is not paradoxical, and indeed is very consistent, and that is Jesus' support for, embrace of, and indeed embodiment of Torah. Not only is he set up to be the perfect keeper of Torah, the perfect rabbinical interpreter of Torah, indeed one who even carries with him authority that's above and beyond what the rabbis can do, and that he can pronounce, you've heard it said before, but I say to you this. Okay, ordinary rabbis can't do that. They have to go by rabbinical precedent, but Jesus can even do better than that. But Jesus is fundamentally about upholding and fulfilling and maintaining the law, which is one of the things I think is very important, that when he goes into this tirade against the scribes and the Pharisees, what doesn't he say? What doesn't he say is the thing that we all think he says, and we all would say ourselves, and many, many people in the history of the church have said afterwards, and that is, you guys are too legalistic, you're too into these little niggling, meaningless provisions of the law, you're too into these, all this legalism nonsense, this rigidity, this strict obedience to this human code, and really what you need to do is, it's all important, just internalize things in your heart and live in harmony with your fellow man and do good and don't be burdened by all these stupid little provisions. Okay, that's our argument, okay? There's a real thread in the whole history of Christianity against this so-called legalism. It really goes back to the church fathers. In their arguments against the Jews of their time, one of the key insults was, look, we've got Jesus and you guys are still trying to keep the law. Therefore, this became a whole argument against the Jews of the day. And of course, the reformers, the Protestant reformers, took that idea and pushed it to the millionth degree, in effect accusing Catholics of being legalists and them about really substituting this idea of a simple faith in exchange instead of rigorous obedience to the law. Okay, all of this is kind of our tradition that we have to wrestle with as we will, but keep in mind this is not Jesus' argument here. Okay, he never once accuses the Pharisees and the scribes of being excessively devoted to the Torah, of being excessively concerned with the provisions of the Torah. Okay, his accusations are two different things. One, hypocrisy. Okay, they don't practice what they preach. Okay, that's a problem for anybody. That's one argument. Two is disproportion, that they tend to emphasize the minor portions of the law to the exclusion of the major portions of the law, and they do this because the minor portions of the law can be easily twisted around for their personal benefit. Okay? In that sense, they lay burdens on the people that they don't do anything to remove. Okay? But if you keep in mind here, if you look carefully at what Jesus says here, none of the arguments he gives here are about them doing the law or teaching people to keep the law per se. Okay? Jesus would never say that, especially not in Matthew's gospel, when all throughout the gospel he's going toe-to-toe with Jewish, particularly rabbinical opponents, okay, as to who's more correct in their understanding of Torah, Jesus or they. Okay, Matthew 23:23, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith." Aha! So he doesn't criticize them for tithing dill and mint and cumin. He criticizes them for doing this and neglecting the bigger stuff. Okay, you see the argument here is one of proportion. Okay, not of obedience. Okay, he even goes on to say, these you ought to have done. That is the smaller portions you ought to have done, but what? Without neglecting the others. You blind guides straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. So understand, the argument from Jesus is not our argument, okay? A lot of Christians, a lot of Catholics, when they go back to read the New Testament, assume that whatever, half-baked nonsense you hear on the internet, on Twitter, on Facebook, on the pulpit in some cases, and RC, it's exactly what you hear in the New Testament. It's often not, and that's why it's always good to go back to the sources again. Okay, so keep in mind, Jesus' attitude to the law is not one of negativity and rejection. Okay, and keep in mind, the very first time in which the law is broached is way back in chapter 5, okay, in which Jesus is telling us, not only is Matthew telling us that Jesus is basically the new Moses, he's going up to the mountain to teach this sermon just like Moses did. He's giving us a new law just like Moses gave the old law. And one of the things here Jesus says in Matthew 5:17, "Think not that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, till all heaven and earth pass away, not an iota nor a dot will pass from the law till all is accomplished." Okay, there's no equivalent saying in Mark, Luke, John, or anywhere else in the New Testament. Okay, this is Matthew's depiction here. So keep in mind, we may have this idea that we've got to catch the Jewish law backhanded, and indeed we do. Okay, we have to catch that law backhanded simply because we all know we live in a time in which what Torah means for us and what Torah meant for the first century Jew are two different things, okay? Now, how we got from, the animal sacrifices, the circumcision, the tithing, the dill, mint, and cumin, the Sabbath, etc., to what we have now, in which we don't say we don't do the law, we kind of catch it backhanded. We have sort of a interesting interpretation of the law. That's really almost a whole different discussion. And indeed, where I would have that discussion is in the letter to the Romans, and how Paul deals with the law there and how Paul actually understands Christians as keeping the law. It's something he says repeatedly. And why it is that the man who has faith is the one who truly not only fulfills the law, but in some sense keeps the law, okay, even though that man is not necessarily circumcised, okay. That is a deep paradox, okay, and that's one we have to wrestle with. But don't take our ideas of, in effect, throwing out the law and putting it back on Jesus and saying that this is his argument against the scribes and the Pharisees. It's not, okay. So I just want to make that clear, and also point out one other thing in this section. This is on chapter 23 still. There's a lot of really neat literary foreshadowing here. This is in chapter 23. Let's turn back there. Jesus goes on near the end of his tirade, and he goes on to say, therefore, this is the sort of the last woe. He says to the scribes and the Pharisees, "Hypocrite, you build the tombs of the prophets, adorn the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part in the shedding of blood of the prophets. Thus you witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I will send you prophets, wise men, scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of the innocent Abel to the blood of Zechariah son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all this will come upon this generation. Notice this theme here: killing the prophet, righteous blood, shedding righteous blood. All of this is, of course, a foreshadowing for what? What's going to happen 2 chapters later in the Passion narrative, and indeed the corresponding result of this, that there's going to be hell to pay for all of this. Okay, that's a good little, very, very brief synopsis of Matthew chapter 23 and some of what I think are its interesting highlights. I'm going to pause. Actually, I'm going to stop for a second, and we're going to do another one of these on the final block of discourse, and that is the so-called Little Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and 25 next.